My name is Claire, and on the night of my mother's birthday, I learned just how far my family was willing to go to humiliate me in front of everyone I loved. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like this video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this. The restaurant was warm and golden with the kind of low lighting that makes everything look like it belongs in a family photo. My mother sat at the head of the long table, a cake already waiting in the wings. We were midway through the second round of wine, the air thick with the smell of garlic butter and roasted lamb, when I noticed her eyes on me, not my face, but my left hand. I shifted in my seat, wondering if she was admiring the engagement ring. I'd been wearing it for 3 months now, still catching myself smiling when it caught the light. My fiancé had chosen it himself. A simple white gold band with a diamond that wasn't extravagant, but was perfect to me. It wasn't just jewelry, it was the only piece of my life that felt entirely mine. Then my mother leaned forward, her voice cutting through the table chatter with surgical precision. "Take it off," she said. "Give it to her. She deserves it more than you." The clink of forks against plates stopped. My cousin, seated 2 chairs away, froze mid-bite. My father, as if on cue, added, "It's the right thing to do. She needs it more." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard them. But my mother's gaze didn't waver, her hand gesturing subtly toward my cousin, Melanie, the golden child of every family gathering, the one who'd grown up hearing she was destined for something grander than the rest of us. I didn't move, my fingers curled instinctively into a fist around the ring, my palm suddenly slick. The room seemed smaller, the air denser, as though the walls themselves were waiting to see if I'd obey. My cousin's lips curved into something between a smirk and a pout, as if she were already halfway to slipping the ring on her own hand. Around the table, reactions ranged from polite confusion to the kind of pointed avoidance that says, "This isn't my business." An aunt cleared her throat. Someone sipped water too quickly. No one spoke up. I forced myself to look at my mother. "What?" The word came out quieter than I intended, but it was enough to invite her to repeat herself. She did, this time slower, as if speaking to a stubborn child. "Claire, take off the ring. Give it to Melanie. She's been through enough lately." Enough. That was the word she'd used when Melanie's engagement had fallen apart a month earlier. Enough when Melanie lost her job but still somehow managed a weekend in Miami. Enough when Melanie's string of bad decisions needed cushioning by the rest of us. My father nodded along, his expression the picture of calm authority. "She deserves a fresh start. You can get another ring. It's just a thing." But it wasn't just a thing. The wine in my glass tasted suddenly sour. I set it down carefully, afraid my hands would betray the tremor in my chest. My fiancé wasn't there that night. Work had called him in unexpectedly. But the thought of explaining this to him later was enough to make my stomach twist. I wanted to laugh, to tell them this was absurd, that no one in their right mind would demand something so personal, so symbolic, so deeply tied to a promise. But laughter wouldn't have landed here. Laughter would have been permission. Instead, I stayed still, my mother's eyes hardened. My cousin glanced at the ring again, then at me, her gaze a silent "why make this harder than it has to be?" In that moment, shame bloomed hot in my throat. Not because of the request, no, the demand, but because I could feel the weight of every gaze on me, waiting to see if I'd comply. The restaurant's warmth now felt suffocating. The smell of garlic butter turned heavy, cloying. My skin prickled with the awareness that I was being tested, cornered, and watched all at once. I thought of the night my fiancé proposed, how he'd taken me to the small park near my apartment, the one with the benches painted a fading green, where we'd sat countless times before, how his hands had been cold but steady as he opened the box, how he'd said he couldn't imagine the rest of his life without me. And now, at my mother's birthday table, surrounded by relatives, that promise was being treated like a trinket to be reassigned. I said nothing. Not then. The silence stretched long enough that the waiter approached, plates balanced on his arm, only to retreat when he caught the tension in the air. My mother eventually turned back to her plate, the moment shelved for later. My cousin smiled faintly, as though she'd won something in advance, but I knew then, this wasn't over. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Toasts were made, cake was served, and I smiled when expected. but my mind was elsewhere, circling the moment like a predator. I replayed it over and over, trying to pin down what stung the most. The public humiliation, the brazen sense of entitlement, or the realization that my parents didn't see my engagement as something sacred. By the time I left the restaurant, the city's night air felt almost cold enough to wash the heaviness off me. Almost. I walked to my car with my coat wrapped tightly around me, the ring still warm against my skin. I didn't take it off. Not for my mother, not for my father, and certainly not for Melanie. But as I drove home, the question settled in like a stone in my gut. If they could ask for this, demand this, what wouldn't they take? This was only the beginning. Before the night at my mother's birthday dinner, before the words, "She deserves it more," lodged themselves in my mind like a splinter, there were years of quiet proof that my cousin Melanie had always been the favored one. We grew up only a few miles apart in Illinois. My mother and her sister, Melanie's mom, were close, the kind of siblings who called each other every day, sometimes more than once, which meant Melanie and I were paired together constantly. Birthdays, holidays, random Sunday dinners. On paper, we were the same. Two girls just a year apart in age, both with brown hair and freckles, both raised in families that preached loyalty and tradition. But in practice, there was always a difference. Melanie was the special one. She sang solos in the school choir, and her voice was described in family circles as angelic, even when she cracked on high notes. She was given dance lessons at a pricey studio while I made do with a worn secondhand keyboard and an occasional art class at the community center. When we played board games at family gatherings, if Melanie lost, someone would quietly slide the game back in her favor, saying it was just for fun, but making sure she never left the table disappointed. Even as kids, I learned the rules. Melanie's feelings mattered most, and my role was to adapt. The divide deepened in high school. Melanie was the homecoming queen candidate. I was the girl working part-time at the grocery store to save for a used car. When Melanie didn't get into her first-choice college, the entire family treated it like a collective tragedy. When I got into mine, without any family fanfare, without a single congratulatory dinner, my parents told me to be practical and consider staying close to home. I stayed. Not because I wanted to, but because the undercurrent in my family had taught me that wanting too much for myself was a kind of selfishness. The favoritism wasn't always loud. It was woven into the small, constant choices. If Melanie had a breakup, my mother would spend hours consoling her, making her favorite soup, offering to take her shopping to cheer her up. When my relationships ended, I was told, "You'll be fine," as if pain was something I should handle alone. It wasn't until I met Daniel, my fiancé, that I began to see the contrast more sharply. Daniel wasn't flashy, but he was steady. He listened when I spoke, remembered small details, made me feel like the center of someone's attention for the first time in my life. When he proposed, it was quiet, thoughtful, and private, exactly how I wanted it. The ring he chose wasn't massive, but it was exactly right. A delicate white gold band, a single diamond that caught the light without screaming for attention. I'd seen bigger rings on women who barely knew their fiancés, but none of that mattered to me. This one was chosen with intention. It was a promise in physical form. When I told my parents about the engagement, the reaction was muted. My mother's, "Oh, that's nice," was followed almost immediately by a question about whether we'd set a date. My father asked about Daniel's job stability. Not once did either of them ask how I felt or even to see the ring up close. The contrast hit me hard a month later when Melanie announced her own engagement to a man she'd been dating for barely 6 months. My parents hosted a full dinner in her honor, complete with champagne and a cake. My mother held Melanie's hand across the table, admiring the ring, saying, "This is what a ring should look like." I swallowed my irritation that night, telling myself it wasn't worth it. But it planted a seed, an awareness that to them, my milestones were less important. My symbols, less worthy. When Melanie's engagement collapsed a few months later, the family's grief was palpable. My mother said, "She's been through so much," as though a broken engagement outweighed anything I'd endured in my life. My father murmured about how unfair it was for her. That was the backdrop leading to my mother's birthday dinner. The idea that my engagement, my ring, could be repurposed for Melanie wasn't born that night. It had been quietly nurtured over years of seeing her placed above me in every way. What made it worse was knowing that if the situation were reversed, if I'd lost my engagement, no one would have dreamed of asking her for hers. They would have told me to move on, to be strong, to not dwell. In the weeks before the birthday dinner, I noticed Melanie making more pointed comments. At a Sunday brunch, she mentioned how perfect my ring would look with her wardrobe. At another gathering, she joked, half-joked really, that if you ever get tired of Daniel, I'll take the ring off your hands. I laughed along, but there was a sliver of something in her tone that didn't feel like humor. I told Daniel about it once, brushing it off as family weirdness. He frowned, said, "That's not okay," and reminded me that the ring was ours, not anyone else's to decide on. I believed him. But believing him and believing my family would respect that were two different things. So when my mother's words cut through the air at that dinner, I wasn't shocked at their audacity. I was shocked at the timing, the deliberate choice to make that demand in front of everyone, to put me in a position where refusal would be painted as cruelty. Looking back, I realized they thought I'd cave, that the years of conditioning, of being the one to step aside, to make space, to adapt, would win out over the small, fierce part of me that had begun to resist. They didn't know that part had been growing, and as I sat at that table, my fingers curled protectively over the ring, I knew this was no longer about jewelry. It was about whether I would keep letting them decide what I deserved. This was the moment everything started to shift. When Daniel proposed, it wasn't in some elaborate setup with photographers hiding in the bushes or a flash mob waiting to burst into choreographed movement. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when the air smelled faintly of damp leaves and wood smoke. We'd gone for a walk after dinner down the familiar path to the little park where we'd first met. The benches were empty, the light from the old street lamp casting everything in a soft amber. He sat me down, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a small navy velvet box. His voice trembled just enough to make mine catch when he asked, "Will you marry me?" The ring inside wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. A slender white gold band, a single diamond, brilliant but understated, exactly the kind of beauty that doesn't shout for attention but draws you in the longer you look. It was perfect because it was us. Quiet, deliberate, chosen with care. I said yes, and the world didn't shift on its axis, but something in me did. For the first time in my adult life, I felt certain that I was stepping into something built entirely on my own choices, not on my family's expectations or permission. The first person I called was my best friend. She screamed so loudly into the phone I had to hold it away from my ear. The second person I called was my mother. "Hi, Mom," I said, still breathless. Daniel proposed. There was a pause, just long enough to notice, before she said, "Oh, that's nice. Did you say yes?" "Yes," I said, laughing a little, trying to keep the mood light. "Of course I said yes." "Well," she replied, "I hope you two thought this through. Marriage is a big decision." That was it. No congratulations. No, "I'm so happy for you." Not even a request to see the ring. She ended the call by reminding me to stop by for Sunday dinner so she could hear more about it. I told myself she just needed time to process. My father's reaction was even shorter. "Does he have a steady job?" I assured him he did. "That's good," was all he said before changing the subject to the rising cost of gas. In the days that followed, I noticed something else. No one in the family reached out. No card in the mail, no bouquet of flowers, not even a text message from my aunts or uncles. It was as if I'd announced I was buying a used car instead of getting engaged. Daniel's family, by contrast, threw us a small party the following weekend. His mother hugged me tightly, beaming as she pulled my hand up to admire the ring. His father opened a bottle of champagne. There were toasts, laughter, and a genuine excitement that made me feel warm all over. Back at my parents' house, Sunday dinner was subdued. I'd worn the ring, hoping it would spark some reaction, but my mother only glanced at it briefly before asking if Daniel had gotten a good deal on it. My father didn't look at it at all. The only person who commented on it was Melanie. She slid into the seat across from me, her eyes locking on my hand before she smiled. "It's cute," she said, drawing out the last word like it was a diplomatic choice. "Not my style, but it suits you." I thanked her, ignoring the slight, but I caught the way my mother's mouth twitched, like she was holding back agreement. From that day on, I could feel the quiet scrutiny every time I wore the ring to a family event. Melanie made small comments here and there, never outright insults, but subtle digs. "I bet it's nice not to have to worry about losing it on vacation," she said once, implying it wasn't valuable enough to guard closely. Another time, she asked if I was planning on upgrading eventually. Daniel told me not to let it bother me, but the truth was, it wasn't just about Melanie. It was about the way my parents seemed to let her commentary pass without challenge, as though they shared her view. When Melanie got engaged a few months later to a man she'd been dating for barely half a year, the difference in treatment was impossible to ignore. My parents hosted a dinner in her honor, complete with champagne, catered food, and a large cake decorated with "Congratulations, Melanie and Jack" in looping script. My mother insisted everyone admire her ring, larger, flashier, and, in her words, exactly what a ring should look like. I smiled through it, telling myself it wasn't worth making waves, but it stung. 3 months later, Melanie's engagement ended. According to my mother, it was heartbreaking, unfair, and such a waste for someone who deserves so much better. My father shook his head and said, "She's been through enough." Those words would come back to haunt me. From then on, I noticed Melanie watching my ring with a different kind of interest. At one brunch, she reached across the table, taking my hand without asking, and said, "If you ever get tired of Daniel, I'll take this off your hands." She laughed, but her eyes didn't match the humor. At another gathering, she said to no one in particular, "Claire's ring would look amazing with that dress I wore to Aunt Linda's wedding." I told Daniel about it once, trying to make it sound like harmless teasing. His jaw tightened. "That's not a joke," he said. "She's testing the waters." I shrugged it off at the time, but deep down, I knew he was right. By the time my mother's birthday dinner rolled around, the tension was already there, an unspoken awareness that my ring had become a character in its own story, one where I was just holding it until Melanie was ready to take center stage. What I didn't know then was how openly they'd be willing to write me out of that story. And when my mother's voice cut through the restaurant that night, telling me to take it off and give it to my cousin, I realized this hadn't been a sudden idea. It had been a long, quiet rehearsal, and I was the only one who hadn't known I'd been cast in it. The night air after my mother's birthday dinner was cold enough to bite at my cheeks, but it still felt warmer than the dining room I had just left. I walked to my car without looking back, my boots clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that sounded too loud in my own ears. The city lights blurred at the edges as if I'd stepped out of one reality and into another, one where the ground rules had shifted without warning. My fingers flexed around the steering wheel before I even started the engine, the diamond of my engagement ring pressing lightly into my skin. That small, familiar weight now felt different. Driving home was like moving through water. My thoughts floated and sank in waves. I replayed the moment over and over, the way my mother's voice had cut across the table, the deliberate cadence in her words, the way my father had nodded along as if it were the most natural request in the world. Take it off. Give it to her. She deserves it more. It wasn't just the request. It was the stage they had chosen. They didn't corner me in private where I could at least react without an audience. They did it in front of nearly the entire family, with servers and strangers close enough to overhear. They chose humiliation over conversation. The worst part was the stillness afterward. No one at the table had defended me. A few relatives had shifted uncomfortably, but no one said, "That's not right," or "Let her be." My aunt had cleared her throat, my uncle had looked down at his plate, and my cousin had sat there with that faint, smug smile. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my chest felt heavy with something between anger and grief. I went straight inside, closing the door harder than I meant to. The house was quiet, Daniel was still at work, and for a moment I just stood there in the dim light of the hallway holding my own hands as if to reassure myself that the ring was still there. I sat on the couch and let the silence stretch. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was thick, pressing against me, demanding I think about what had happened. My mother's words didn't feel like a request born from impulse. They felt rehearsed. My father's agreement had been immediate, almost mechanical, like a line he'd been waiting to deliver. I thought back to the last few months, The way Melanie had eyed my ring, the offhand comments, the subtle digs about its size or style. They had been planting seeds, and now, at my mother's birthday, they'd decided it was time to harvest. There was something deeply unsettling about realizing that a moment I thought was spontaneous had probably been discussed without me, maybe even laughed about, before I ever walked into that restaurant. I went into the kitchen and poured a glass of water, though I wasn't thirsty. The ring caught the overhead light as I lifted the glass, a brief glint of defiance in the otherwise still air. I set it down and pressed my palms against the counter, grounding myself. I could still picture Melanie's face, the slight upward curve of her mouth when my mother had spoken. She hadn't looked surprised, only expectant, as though she'd been waiting for this, counting on it. The realization burned hotter than my mother's words. The humiliation from the dinner was now hardening into something sharper. For most of my life, I had played the role assigned to me, the one who adjusted, the one who stepped back so someone else could shine. I had done it quietly, without open resentment, convincing myself that keeping the peace was worth the small cuts to my pride. But this wasn't a small cut. This was a public stripping away of something that was mine, not just the ring, but the meaning it carried. It was Daniel's promise. It was my choice to say yes. It was our future together. And they had tried to take it as though it were just a piece of metal, a decorative trinket to be reassigned. I walked to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. The ring was warm from my skin, a soft imprint left behind where it rested on my finger. I turned it slowly, the diamond catching the faint light from the bedside lamp. I thought of Daniel, of the park where he'd proposed, of the way his voice had cracked just slightly when he asked the question. Number. They couldn't have this, not the ring, not the story, not the meaning behind it. I took a long breath and let my shoulders relax. This wasn't the first time my family had tried to diminish something of mine, but it would be the last time I let it happen without consequence. I didn't know exactly what the consequence would be yet, but I knew I couldn't let the night pass without some kind of reckoning in the days to come. For the rest of the evening, I moved through the house in near silence. I tidied the kitchen, folded laundry, anything to keep my hands busy while my mind stayed fixed on that dinner table. I didn't cry, though the weight in my chest made it feel like I should. Instead, I felt an odd clarity, like I'd been given undeniable proof of something I had only suspected before. They didn't see me as someone with boundaries. They saw me as an extension of the family's wants, someone whose possessions, happiness, even relationships could be rearranged to suit their version of fairness. And if that was true, then the only way to keep what mattered to me was to stop giving them access to it. When Daniel came home later, I didn't launch into the story right away. I sat with him on the couch, letting the hum of the television fill the space for a while. Part of me wanted to shield him from the ugliness of what had happened, but another part knew that hiding it would only give the moment more power. As the night wore on, the sharp sting of the dinner shifted into something more solid. Resolve. I didn't know exactly what my next step would be, but I knew it wouldn't be silence. Because if I stayed quiet, they'd think I'd accepted it, and I hadn't, not this time. The morning after my mother's birthday dinner, I woke with that strange heaviness you feel after a bad dream, except this wasn't a dream. The words were still there, sharp and fresh, lodged in my mind. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling up from the mug. Part of me wanted to just put the whole thing away, chalk it up to another bizarre family moment, and move on. But something about the way it happened, the certainty in my parents' voices, the lack of surprise on Melanie's face, told me there was more to it. This wasn't spontaneous. It had been building. I decided to test that theory. First, I called my Aunt Linda. She wasn't at the dinner, but she was the kind of person who usually had a read on family dynamics. I kept my voice casual, as if I were sharing an odd anecdote. Hey, you won't believe what happened at Mom's birthday dinner. I told her the bare bones of the story. Her pause was too long to be ignorance. Oh, yeah, I'd heard something about that. My stomach dropped. From who? Your mom mentioned it a couple weeks ago. Just in passing, she said quickly, as though minimizing it might make it sound better. Something about how Melanie was going through a hard time and how she thought maybe you'd be willing to help her out in some way. I thanked her and ended the call, but my hands were shaking. A couple of weeks ago. So they had been planning it. That afternoon, I went by my parents' house under the pretense of dropping off some leftovers from the dinner. They weren't home, but I knew where my mother kept the mail, a neat stack on the kitchen counter next to her tablet. She often left it unlocked, a habit I'd noticed for years. I told myself I wasn't snooping, just looking for confirmation. My pulse said otherwise. The messages were there in plain sight. A group text between my mother, my father, and Melanie. Melanie, I just keep thinking about Claire's ring. It's exactly what I wanted before everything fell apart. Mom, I know, it would be perfect for you. Dad, Claire's not really sentimental about things like that. She'll understand once we explain. Mom, I'll bring it up at my birthday dinner. Public setting might make it easier, less awkward for her to say no if it's in front of everyone. The timestamp on that message was 10 days before the dinner. My hands tightened around the edge of the counter until my knuckles ached. They'd choreographed it down to the location and timing. They knew I'd be trapped, that refusing would make me look petty. I took a photo of the conversation with my phone, my thumb moving automatically. It felt surreal, like I'd stumbled into a script I didn't know I was acting in. That night, I sat in my own kitchen with the screenshot glowing on my phone screen. Every word was a small betrayal, but the part that stuck with me was my father's. She'll understand once we explain. Explain what? That my engagement was less important than my cousin's comfort? That my boundaries were optional? That everything I had could be reassigned if someone else decided they deserved it more? I thought about Melanie reading that thread, smiling, maybe even planning what she'd wear the day she took the ring. I imagined her slipping it on, the same fingers that had once gestured across the table at brunch, saying it would look better on her anyway. The betrayal wasn't just about the ring, it was about realizing my family was willing to strip away something deeply personal and call it generosity on my part. For the next few days, I didn't reach out to them. I needed space to decide what this meant for me, for Daniel, for the boundaries I should have set a long time ago. Daniel noticed my quiet. One evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, he asked, "Is this about the birthday thing?" I told him everything. The awkward dinner, the public demand, and now the screenshot. He read the messages, his jaw tightening with each line. "They planned it," he said flatly. "Yes." "They talked about you like you were just going to roll over and do it." "Yes." He put the phone down, looking at me like he was seeing my family through new eyes. "Claire, if they think they can take something like this from you, they'll think they can take anything." I knew he was right. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The screenshot burned into my memory. I thought of all the smaller moments over the years when I'd let things slide. Let Melanie take the spotlight. Let my parents brush past my achievements. Let their subtle favoritism go unchallenged because it was easier than starting a fight. I realized then that this was the final link in a chain I had been allowing to wrap around me for years. The only way to break it was to make it clear, without hesitation, that this line couldn't be crossed. It wasn't about convincing them to respect me. It was about deciding I wouldn't give them the opportunity to disrespect me again. By the end of the week, I had a plan. Not to confront them in a screaming match, not to throw accusations, but to make sure the ring and everything it represented stayed exactly where it belonged. And for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something that had been missing since the birthday dinner. Control. 2 weeks after my mother's birthday dinner, I saw Melanie again. It wasn't planned. I'd been invited to a casual family get-together at my aunt's house, a Sunday barbecue, the kind of event where the smell of charcoal and sizzling meat usually softened edges between people. But that day, the air felt heavier, like the conversation would carry more weight than the smoke curling from the grill. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to avoid her entirely, to keep my distance until I figured out my next move. But another part, the one that had been growing since the dinner, knew that staying away would be giving her the comfort of my absence. I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to see that the ring was still on my hand. When I arrived, the backyard was already busy. Children ran in circles around lawn chairs, adults milled about with paper plates in hand, and music drifted softly from a speaker near the porch. I spotted Melanie near the drink table, laughing at something my uncle had said. Her laughter stopped the moment she saw me. I didn't rush over. I took my time greeting a few cousins, setting down the dessert I'd brought, pouring myself a lemonade. But eventually, the slow orbit of the gathering brought us face to face. We stood there for a moment, two polite statues in sundresses, the gap between us full of unspoken history. I let my hand rest casually at my side, the diamond catching the sunlight. Her eyes flickered to it before meeting mine again. The last time we'd been this close was at my mother's dinner, her expression smug, my hands tight around what was mine. Now, her face was neutral, almost cautious. I didn't speak first. She gave me a small smile that didn't reach her eyes and said something about how nice the weather was. I nodded, the silence between us stretching like an unspoken challenge. She didn't mention the ring. I didn't mention the dinner, but I could feel the weight of it pressing against both of us. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed her keeping her distance, drifting into conversations, but never lingering near me for long. And yet, every so often, I'd catch her looking, her gaze sliding to my hand as if checking whether the ring had somehow changed hands in the last half hour. I stayed composed. I didn't fidget with the ring, didn't hide my hand, but I also didn't flaunt it. My presence there, wearing it openly, was statement enough. When the food was served, I took a seat at one of the picnic tables. Melanie sat 2 spots down, close enough to see the glint of the diamond whenever I reached for my drink. I could feel her discomfort growing with each passing minute. She was used to getting what she wanted, and I could tell that the unspoken no was louder to her than any confrontation would have been. By dessert, the tension had settled into something almost satisfying. I didn't need to make a scene. I didn't need to humiliate her the way my parents had tried to humiliate me. Simply being there, ring intact, posture steady, was enough to tip the balance back in my favor. Later, as I was leaving, I passed her near the gate. She looked at me for a second too long, her lips parting like she was about to say something. But she didn't. She just stepped aside to let me pass. Driving home, I thought about the look in her eyes. It wasn't defeat exactly, but it wasn't triumph either. It was the look of someone who realized the rules had changed, that the person they'd expected to bow had decided to stand. The quiet victory didn't erase the hurt from the dinner or the betrayal I'd uncovered in that text thread, but it was a reminder that I didn't have to match their tactics to win. Sometimes refusing to yield was enough. I knew this wasn't over. My parents hadn't said a word to me since that night, which told me they were either stewing in silence or plotting their next move. But the difference now was that I no longer felt like I was waiting for their approval or their permission to keep what was mine. The ring was still on my finger, and so was the resolve. 3 nights after the barbecue at my aunt's house, I sat across from Daniel at our small kitchen table. The dinner plates between us were pushed to the side, the remains of roasted chicken and vegetables cooling in the quiet. We'd been talking about work, about a movie we'd both wanted to see, but I could feel the real conversation sitting in the space between us, unspoken but undeniable. It was time to talk about the ring, not about its style or its value, but about what it had come to represent and what we were going to do about the family's attempt to take it from me. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying my face. "You've been holding a lot in," he said gently. I nodded. I needed to see them again. See her. I guess I wanted to make sure I wasn't overreacting. "And? I'm not," I said, my voice steady. "They planned it, Daniel. They talked about it like it was just logistics, like I'd roll over and do it. And when I didn't, it wasn't over for them. I could see it in her face at the barbecue. She's still thinking about it." He was silent for a moment, his jaw tightening. "Then we need to decide how we handle this. Because I'm not watching you get steamrolled by them. Not over this. Not over anything." The weight of his words settled over me like a shield. Daniel had always been steady, but there was a steel edge to him now. I twisted the ring gently on my finger, feeling its smooth band under my skin. "This isn't just about the ring anymore," I said. "It's about boundaries. I've spent my whole life letting them decide how much I'm allowed to have, how much I'm allowed to keep. And if I give in now, if I hand this over, they'll know they can take anything." His eyes stayed on mine. "Then we draw the line here. No compromise. No pretending it's fine to keep the peace." Something inside me loosened. Not because I needed his permission, this decision was mine, but because I knew he was with me completely. There would be no cracks for them to slip through, no moment where I'd be alone in this. We talked about what might come next. The phone calls, the guilt trips, the carefully crafted arguments about family and fairness. I'd heard them all before, in different contexts, over smaller things. This time we agreed the answer would be the same: no. The conversation turned practical. Daniel suggested we make sure the ring was insured, not because he thought it would be taken by force, but because we both knew my parents wouldn't see boundaries as permanent. If they couldn't get it from me willingly, they might try another route. I agreed, and as we talked through the details, I realized how different this felt from every other time I'd tried to stand up to my family. In the past, I'd always been alone in the fight, and the weight of their disapproval had been enough to wear me down. Now, it wasn't just my voice saying no, it was ours. After the practicalities were settled, the room grew quiet again. Daniel reached across the table, taking my hand in his. His thumb brushed over the diamond, and his voice softened. This ring was never just about us getting married. It was about me choosing you, and you choosing me, and I'm not letting anyone rewrite that. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. Neither am I. That night lying in bed, I felt something I hadn't felt since the night of the birthday dinner. Calm. Not the fragile, temporary calm that comes from avoiding conflict, but the kind that grows when you know you've made a decision and there's no turning back. I understood then that the ring wasn't the real prize my family was after. What they wanted was proof that I could still be made small, that I could still be maneuvered into giving up something important if the pressure was high enough. They weren't going to get that proof. In the days that followed, I didn't reach out to my parents or Melanie. I went about my life, work, errands, quiet evenings with Daniel, carrying the certainty we'd forged at that kitchen table. The silence from my family was telling. No calls, no texts, no sudden stop by for coffee invitations. I imagined them stewing, recalculating, maybe even waiting for me to come to them, but I wasn't going to. This wasn't a pause in the fight, it was a new reality. The line had been drawn, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on my side of it with both feet firmly planted. It started with small ripples. 2 weeks after Daniel and I drew our line in the sand, I began to hear about the conversations happening in corners I wasn't invited to. My cousin Aaron, who had been at my mother's birthday dinner but had said nothing at the time, sent me a text out of nowhere. "I can't believe they did that to you." I stared at the message, unsure how to reply. I typed thanks and deleted it. I typed you could have said something and deleted that too. In the end, I just wrote, yeah, me neither. Erin didn't respond, but her silence after that said enough. She'd reached out to ease her own conscience, not mine. Still, the fact that she even acknowledged it told me something. The story was making its rounds, and not everyone thought my parents were in the right. It was my Aunt Linda who confirmed it. We met for coffee on a rainy Thursday, and after a few pleasantries, she leaned in, her voice low. "Your mother's been getting calls. People think it was inappropriate." Inappropriate, I repeated, rolling the word over in my mind like a smooth stone. It was such a mild word for what had happened, like calling a knife wound a paper cut. But coming from my family, it was almost revolutionary. Linda stirred her coffee, avoiding my eyes. "She's not happy about it. Says you've embarrassed her by not letting it go." I let out a short laugh, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity needed somewhere to go. She embarrassed herself. I just didn't hand her the ending she wanted. According to Linda, some of the older relatives had been particularly vocal. My great-aunt Marie, who rarely came to family functions anymore, apparently called my mother to ask, "What kind of person asks for their daughter's engagement ring for someone else?" The cracks were showing, and they weren't just in the family's perception of my parents, they were in their perception of Melanie too. Erin's mother had apparently told someone that Melanie had gone too far this time, and the comment had found its way back to her. Melanie's response, as I heard it from a third cousin, was to play the victim. She told anyone who would listen that she hadn't asked for the ring, that it was Mom and Dad's idea, and she'd been too embarrassed to refuse. It was a neat rewriting of history, one that erased her own messages in that group chat, but without the screenshot I'd taken, I couldn't prove it to the rest of the family. Not that I intended to try. I didn't need to defend myself to them. The truth was already working its way through on its own. The next time I saw my parents was at a larger family event, a belated Easter lunch hosted by one of my uncles. I hadn't decided whether I was going until the morning of. Daniel offered to go with me, and I accepted. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of thinking I was hiding. When we arrived, I could feel the temperature shift. Conversation softened as I passed by. Eyes darted between me and my hand. The ring caught the light deliberately as I reached for a glass of water, and I didn't miss the way my mother's jaw tightened. We exchanged polite hellos, nothing more. She didn't mention the dinner, the ring, or the growing murmur of disapproval in the family. But the air between us was charged, each of us aware of the audience. Melanie stayed mostly on the opposite side of the room. Once, I caught her looking at me, her gaze flicking to the ring and back up to my face. It was a quick glance, but the tightness around her mouth told me everything. She hated that I still had it, hated even more that I was wearing it in front of her. The tension followed me through the afternoon, but I wore it like armor. Every polite conversation, every forced smile, was a reminder that they no longer held the same power over me. They couldn't take what I wasn't willing to give. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a shift in how people interacted with me. A few cousins reached out to make plans on their own, separate from my parents. Others, like Aaron, stayed quiet, perhaps afraid of choosing sides openly. But the choice had already been made. By standing firm, I'd drawn a dividing line that no one could pretend wasn't there. My parents, for their part, seemed to retreat. They stopped inviting me to small gatherings, sending word through other relatives instead of reaching out directly. At first, it stung, being excluded from traditions I'd grown up with. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was just another attempt to regain control, to make me feel the loss and come crawling back. I didn't. Instead, I filled my calendar with things that had nothing to do with them. Dinner with friends, weekend trips with Daniel, quiet nights where the only voices in my head were my own. The fallout wasn't loud. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors. But it was steady, like a tide pulling away from the shore. Every week that passed without me giving in was another week where they had to live with the reality that they hadn't gotten what they wanted. It was a slow shift, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground of my own making. In the months following the Easter lunch, the silence from my parents became a kind of background noise, always there, but never loud enough to drown out the rest of my life. At first, I noticed it in the obvious ways. No calls, no texts, no casual drop-by invitations. The calendar that had once been dotted with family events was suddenly blank, leaving space I didn't know I'd been craving until I had it. I filled that space quickly. Dinner with friends on Wednesday nights, a Saturday morning farmer's market ritual with Daniel, long walks in the park where he'd proposed, where the quiet was ours and ours alone. The absence of my parents' constant presence felt strange at first, like walking into a room and finding the furniture rearranged. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized something important. The space they'd vacated wasn't empty. It was being filled by people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could be persuaded to give up. One of the first changes I made was to narrow my circle. I stopped chasing relationships that required constant explanation or justification. The cousins who stayed silent at my mother's birthday dinner, I didn't cut them off entirely, but I stopped making the effort to bridge the gap. If they wanted to talk, they knew where to find me. Instead, I leaned into the people who had reached out sincerely, like my friend Jenna, who had been one of the first to celebrate my engagement without hesitation. She and her husband invited us over for dinner one Friday night, and somewhere between dessert and coffee, she looked at me and said, "You seem lighter." I thought about that for a moment before answering. I think I am. It's like I'm not carrying someone else's expectations on my back anymore. She smiled knowingly. That's what happens when you start living for yourself. Daniel and I also started talking more seriously about the wedding. At first, I'd imagined a large event with the whole family there because that's what I'd been taught weddings were supposed to be. But the more we planned, the more I realized I didn't want the day to feel like a performance for people who didn't truly want to see me happy. We scaled back. Instead of a ballroom, we chose a small vineyard about an hour outside the city. Instead of a guest list of 200, we pared it down to 60. The people who had stood by us, celebrated with us, and shown up when it mattered. That meant some obvious exclusions. My parents, Melanie, a handful of extended relatives who had been more concerned with staying neutral than standing up for what was right. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. The wedding would be about us, not about managing other people's egos. As the months went on, I could feel the ripple effects of my decision not to hand over the ring. It had become more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol, a reminder that I could hold my ground. There were moments, though, when I felt the weight of what I'd lost. Holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving came, and instead of sitting at my parents' long dining table, passing dishes and enduring pointed comments, Daniel and I spent the day with friends who had invited us into their home. It was warm and lively, and for the first time in years, I left a holiday gathering feeling lighter than when I arrived. Christmas was similar. No carefully wrapped box from my mother, no stiff hug from my father. Instead, we stayed home, cooked dinner together, and opened gifts in our pajamas. It was quiet, and it was enough. I realized then that I hadn't lost a family. I'd simply stopped prioritizing the one that refused to treat me like an equal. The wedding planning became a kind of anchor for me during that time. Each decision we made, each invitation sent, each vendor booked, was a reminder that I was building a future with Daniel that didn't depend on the approval or involvement of people who had tried to undermine it. We visited the vineyard in early spring, walking hand in hand between the rows of vines still bare from winter. The owner, a warm woman named Teresa, showed us where the ceremony would take place, a small clearing framed by blooming lavender. I could already picture it, my closest friends seated on either side, Daniel waiting for me at the end of the aisle, the ring on my finger catching the sunlight. I didn't think about my parents in that moment. I didn't think about Melanie. I thought about the choice I'd made to protect what was mine, and how that choice had led me here. In April, I got an email from my mother. It was short, almost businesslike. I heard you're planning a small wedding. I hope you'll reconsider the guest list. Family should be there for important milestones. I stared at the words for a long time before closing the email without replying. I didn't need to explain my decision to someone who had tried to erase the meaning of my engagement in front of a room full of people. Daniel saw the look on my face when he came home that evening. "Your mom?" he guessed. "Yeah," I said, handing him my phone. He read the email, handed it back, and simply said, "We're not reconsidering." And that was that. As summer approached, I noticed something shifting in myself. I wasn't bracing for the next slight or preparing for the next manipulation. I wasn't scanning rooms for my parents' approval. I was just living. One night, sitting on the back porch with Daniel, I told him, I used to think I'd feel empty without them, but I think I'm finally learning that my life doesn't have to have that constant tension to feel full." He squeezed my hand. "That's because you're filling it with the right people now." The wedding day came in early June. The sky was clear, the air warm but not stifling. As I stood in the small dressing room at the vineyard, Jenna helped me fasten the clasp of a simple necklace, her hands steady against my shoulder. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw more than a bride. I saw someone who had stopped apologizing for wanting to protect what mattered to her. Someone who had chosen her own circle and built a life within it. The ceremony was intimate, just as we'd planned. I walked down the aisle to Daniel, my eyes fixed on his. The ring on my finger caught the sunlight exactly as I'd imagined, and when we said our vows, I felt the weight of every moment that had led us there. Not as a burden, but as proof of what we'd built together. There was no empty chair for my parents, no lingering sense of absence. The people who mattered were there, and that was enough. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon and the fairy lights overhead began to glow, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The music played, the wine flowed, and laughter rose into the warm night air. And for the first time since my mother's birthday dinner, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. I hadn't just kept the ring, I had kept my self-respect, I had kept my future intact, and I had chosen my own circle to share it with. The morning after our wedding, sunlight spilled through the gauzy curtains of the small cottage at the vineyard. For a few minutes, I lay there in the quiet, listening to the faint hum of the summer cicadas outside. Daniel was still asleep, his hand resting lightly against mine. The ring glinted on my finger in the soft light, and I couldn't help but think of how far we had come. It was more than just a wedding ring. It was a declaration that I had stood my ground when it mattered most, that I had chosen my own future rather than letting it be chosen for me. I thought about the long road to this moment, the birthday dinner, the group chat I wasn't supposed to see, the silent barbs and public ambushes. The old me might have tried to make peace, to give a piece of myself away just to keep everyone smiling. But the woman lying here now didn't measure her worth by how much she could sacrifice for others' comfort. We spent the first day of our marriage doing almost nothing at all, walking through the vineyard's quiet paths, sharing leftover cake in the shade of the big oak near the ceremony site, talking about everything and nothing. Daniel asked me at one point, "Do you think your parents will reach out?" I shrugged. "Probably, but I'm not sure I'll respond. I think they've gotten used to me being the one to bridge the gap. This time, if they want a connection, they'll have to do the work." He nodded, and there was no push, no guilt, just quiet agreement. That, more than anything, was why I'd married him. In the weeks after the wedding, life settled into a rhythm that felt entirely ours. We hosted a few friends for dinner, sent thank you notes to our guests, and started talking about small home projects. It wasn't glamorous or dramatic. It was steady, and it was real. But even in that peace, there were reminders of what I'd left behind. A cousin sent a message saying she'd seen my parents at a family barbecue and that they'd avoided talking about me entirely. Melanie, apparently, had been unusually quiet. It was strange to think about them existing in a parallel version of family life without me in it. But the truth was, I didn't miss it. The absence wasn't a wound anymore. It was a clean, healed space where something new could grow. I began to notice other changes in myself too. The hesitation I used to feel before saying no was fading. When a coworker tried to shift part of their project onto me, I declined without over-explaining. When an old acquaintance asked me to attend an event I didn't want to go to, I simply said I couldn't make it and left it at that. Setting boundaries in one part of my life had taught me how to set them everywhere else. Daniel noticed it too. One evening, while we were sitting on the porch with glasses of wine, he said, "You stand differently now." I laughed. "What does that even mean?" "It means," he said, smiling, "that you don't look like you're waiting for someone to knock you off balance." I thought about that later, lying in bed. He was right. For so long, I'd carried myself like I was bracing for impact. Now, I felt rooted. By late summer, we had framed and hung a photo from the wedding in our living room. In it, Daniel and I are laughing as we walk down the aisle, my bouquet in one hand, his fingers intertwined with mine in the other. My ring catches the sunlight, just a flash, but enough to see it's still there, still mine. Friends who came over would often stop to look at the photo. Some would comment on the joy in it, others on the intimacy. No one, of course, knew the private battle behind that moment, how much it had taken for me to walk down that aisle with both the ring and my dignity intact. And that was fine. The story didn't need to be told to everyone. It just needed to be lived by me. In September, I received another email from my mother. This one was longer, more careful. She wrote about how she'd been thinking a lot and how families go through ups and downs. She didn't apologize, but she said she hoped we could start fresh. I read it twice, feeling the weight of what wasn't said. She wasn't acknowledging what she'd done. She was simply trying to step over it, to resume the relationship without taking responsibility. In the past, I might have accepted that. I might have told myself it was better than nothing, that some connection was better than none. But now, I saw it for what it was, an invitation to walk back into the same dynamic I'd fought to leave. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. The holidays came again, and for the second year in a row, I didn't see my parents or Melanie. Instead, Daniel and I traveled to Vermont to spend Christmas in a small cabin we'd rented. Snow piled up outside, and we spent the days cooking, reading, and sitting by the fire. One night, as we sipped hot chocolate, Daniel said, "I'm glad we're here." "Me too," I said, and I meant it. Not just about the cabin, but about this life we were building, free from the constant pressure to fit into a mold that had never been made for me. By the time spring rolled around again, it had been a year since the birthday dinner. A year since my parents tried to take something from me in the most public, humiliating way possible. A year since I decided they wouldn't. I thought about that as I stood in the park where Daniel had proposed, the air smelling faintly of fresh grass and rain. The bench where we'd sat was the same, the street lamp still leaning slightly to one side. If I'd given in that night, if I'd taken off the ring and handed it to Melanie, everything would be different now. I'd still be tangled in the same family patterns, still bracing for the next demand. Instead, I was here, married, free, certain that the people in my life wanted me for me, not for what they could take from me. The day we celebrated our first wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised me with a small box. I opened it to find a delicate gold bracelet, simple but elegant. Inside the lid of the box, he'd had it engraved with 3 words, "Still ours, always." I knew exactly what he meant. It wasn't just about the ring or the bracelet or any other piece of jewelry. It was about our life, built deliberately, defended when necessary, and kept safe from those who would try to claim it for themselves. To anyone else, the story of a ring might seem small, but to me, it was never just about the metal or the diamond. It was about a moment where I had to choose whether to keep what mattered to me or give it away to keep other people comfortable. And in that choice, I found something bigger than a piece of jewelry. I found my voice, my boundaries, my life. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight to keep what's yours, or to stand your ground when it would have been easier to step aside, I hope you know this. You're not wrong for protecting yourself. You're not selfish for setting limits, and you're not unkind for refusing to let someone else decide what you deserve. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening, and take care of yourself. You're worth standing up for.